Bien, pues comenzamos con la última intervención, que corre a cargo del padre doctor Viliam Dóci, formado en Austria, en la Universidad de Viena, doctorado en Historia de la Iglesia. Me hace particular ilusión presentarlo, porque la verdad es que es un referente para mí en Roma. Está al frente del Instituto Histórico de la Orden de Predicadores en Roma, donde lleva a cabo pues, una labor muy activa a nivel formativo, de acogida de investigadores y sobre todo con lo que es la publicación insignia de la Orden. Él ha estudiado una gran diversidad de temas, la historia de la Orden de Predicadores en los siglos XVII y XVIII, la historia de la predicación, la historia de la educación académica en la Orden de los Dominicos, las bibliotecas dominicas en la época medieval y principios de la época moderna, y va a hacer la última intervención en torno al maestro general Juan Tomás de Boxadors, en este caso analizando su gobierno en lo relativo a la provincia dominicana de Hungría. Gracias, cuando quiera.
Thank you, Bernard, for the nice introduction. So I will start immediately with the begin of the government of Juan Tomás de Boxadors. It means with the general chapter of 1756. In his introductory letter to the acts of the general chapter, the newly elected Master General Juan Tomás de Boxadors set out two particular commitments for Dominicans in addition to their general Christian obligations. The first was to observe the order's constitutions, or regular discipline, and the second was to cultivate literary studies, specifically theology and philosophy. Regarding the latter commitment, the Master General explicitly stated the order's obligation to adhere to the teachings of St. Thomas Aquinas. The governance of the Master de Boxadors concerning the Dominican province of Hungary can be examined from these two perspectives. Although studies represent a clearly defined field, the obligation to adhere to the constitutions applies to all areas of individual and community life to which the Dominicans have committed themselves by their profession. The surviving sources indeed attest that the Master of the Order dealt with a wide range of situations and issues in the province of Hungary, exercising his authority to ensure that the life of the province, its convents and monasteries, and individual religious, both friars and nuns, proceeded in accordance with the constitutions. Tibor Marti has already explained what we mean by the Dominican provincia Hungary in the 18th century, so I don't need to explain it to you again. When we want to examine the governance of Master de Boxadors with regard to the Dominicans in Austria and Hungary, we encounter a similar challenge with regard to the preserved archival documentation, as mentioned by Tibor in relation to the governance of Master Ripoll. From the first 6 months of his term of office, it means still in 1756, we find no letters received by Master de Boxadors in the Order's General Archives at Santa Sabina under the respective archival records of series Decima Tertia. Several letters have been preserved from 1757, including correspondence from the provincial, other friars, both individual and communities, and one letter is preserved that from a monastery, from a female monastery, from the priories of the monastery in Tulln is in Lower Austria, or it was in Lower Austria, it doesn't exist anymore. However, there is not a single letter sent from the province in the General Archives from 1758 and 59, also the years 67, 70, 71, 73 to 76 are missing. So what I have written there on the slide, are the covered years in the archives: 57, 60, 61, 68 to 69, and 72. All other years are not covered. However, the Fondo Dominicani II of the Vatican Apostolic Archives contains around 30 letters sent to the Master of the Order by friars in Austria and Hungary in 1758. It's interesting, almost all of them are linked to the same situation. After the provincial chapter of 1757, the friars were requested to complete their third exam as confessors in order to be permitted to hear confessions in the province. But there were some older friars, or some friars who already have been appointed as general preachers, predicatores generales, and according to the previous custom of the province, they did not complete the third exam. They were allowed to ask, but they also needed to ask for permission or for dispensation from the Master of the Order not to be obliged to go and be examined by the commission. So we have a group of letters from those friars who wrote to Rome, explained, Most Reverend Father, I have been this and this, please let me free from the exam. Again, that collection from 1758 is preserved in the archives, in the apostolic archives of the Vatican. Napoleon Bonaparte is in some way responsible for this curious fact, as he had the contents of the Dominican General Archives transferred to Paris, and when the archival materials returned to Rome, some of them terminated their way in the Vatican. The registers of the Master of the Order relating to the province of Hungary, especially from 1768 onwards, primarily comprise entries regarding the confirmation and appointment of brothers to various offices, as well as the granting of dispensations. So this is all, again, a problem to analyze better this relation between the master and the province, because we only have a list of what the master usually did, as he confirmed the regions of studies, the baccalaureate and some other offices. He appointed the preachers general. So it's difficult to say something about, I would say, more personal involvement based on this register from 1768 onwards. Now, when we speak about the difficult situation with regard to the archival documentation in Rome, at the General Curia, the situation regarding sources in the archives of the former province of Hungary and Austria is even worse. The archives of the Dominican convent in Vienna, where the provincial seat was located, contain no correspondence from Rome, so all letters have been lost. Nevertheless, other sources are available that allow us to learn about the attention that the Boxadors devoted to the province as Master of the Order. And what I mentioned there, you see that, so there is one source in the archives of the Dominican Priory in Vienna, no correspondence, but this is a register book of the House of General Studies. I will mention it later. Then there is an archive, or the archive of Dominican monastery in Lienz. It's in Tyrol, in the Austrian part of Tyrol. By a miracle, the acts of the only preserved acts of the provincial chapters of 1757 and 60, I will mention them later, have been preserved in the archives of the Dominican nuns. We don't have other copies in Vienna, for instance. And those last registers from the series 4 in the General Archives in Rome pertain to the provinces of Italy. I will tell something to that collection or to that sample of registers later. Just we are speaking about the province of Hungary and Austria, but we are also using archival documents that are connected to other provinces. Why? I will tell it later. So, I mentioned Dominican life according to the constitutions and the cultivation of studies as two ways of approaching the topic of Master de Boxadors and the province of Hungary. This is the map which Tibor kindly borrowed to me just to show you some geographical situation of the province, which was the same. So the convents or the towns didn't change their place in the geography of the province. So the first of these fields, the constitutions or the observation of constitutions, we can examine it using the example of the provincial chapter of 1757 and provincial chapter of 1757 and 1760. The elective chapter in 1757, it's a mistake, so 1757, was originally supposed to take place in the convent of Bolzano in South Tyrol. The convent was located in the southwestern edge of the province, quite far away from the eastern Austrian and even more so from the Hungarian convents. You see it. Now the provincial Joseph Riedel requested a dispensation from the Master de Boxadors to hold the provincial chapter at the convent in Steyr in Upper Austria. You see, can I use this? Yes. Okay. Steyr is here, which was more easy to be reached by the friars from Košice, from Hungarian convents, okay, in the center. Given the war in which the Habsburg monarchy had been involved since 1756, and this war had placed an additional financial burden on the individual convents of the province, relocating the chapter would ensure a fairer distribution of costs among the convents. After the Master had approved the transfer, the brothers from Bolzano asked him to designate their convent as the location for the subsequent chapter, which was due to take place in 1761. However, this did not happen. It means the Master didn't interfere. The Master let the provincial chapter of 1757 to designate the future place, and Vienna, the convent of Vienna, was designated. The acts of the provincial chapter held in May 1757, at which Father Constantin Herzog was elected as the new provincial, have been preserved, as has the confirmation letter from the Master dated 29 October 1757. A comparison of these two texts reveals that Master de Boxadors provided detailed commentary on the ordinaciones and criticized numerous points for being imprecise and inconsistent with the order's legislative tradition. For instance, de Boxadors emphasized that the chapter fathers had included statements under the ordinances, ordinaciones, that should have been listed separately as admonitions, admoniciones. De Boxadors also explained the difference between the two. Some of the chapter statements did not actually introduce any new obligations for the friars, and such statements are ordinaciones, or should be named as ordinaciones. Some statements merely reminded the friars of existing order or church laws, urging them to comply with them, and consequently they should be named as admonitions. This was more of a formal matter, but the precision prevented the impression that the number of laws was increasing. In reality, the aim was simply to ensure better compliance with existing legislation. In several places where the chapter called on the friars to adhere more strictly to the order's discipline, the master of the order felt that the demands were insufficient. For example, Ordinatio Prima, which the master considered to be more of an admonitio, required the brothers to undertake 10 days of spiritual retreat each year. The master said, okay, but he recalled an existing regulation from previous general chapters that the priors of the convents had to present confirmation from their communities that they had completed such a retreat in order to have an active voice in the provincial chapter. So also the superiors of the communities should be controlled in some way by their communities. Following the sudden death of provincial Constantine Herzog in April 1760, the provincial chapter in Vienna began on the 31st of August 1760 instead of in 1761 as originally planned. Master de Boxadors granted permission to anticipate the chapter. De Boxadors stayed in Rome until mid-September 1760, then he departed for the canonical visitation of the Spanish provinces. The master of the order's 4-year absence from Rome resulted in the unusual circumstance that the acts of the 1760 provincial chapter were not confirmed until the 5th of January 1765. In his letter of confirmation, the master states that he read the acts after returning from the visitation in Spain. Let us note that already at the end of April 1765, another chapter of the province of Hungary was celebrated, this time in Graz. So the confirmed acts were valid for 5-6 months until the confirmation of the next chapter. However, let us focus on the chapter acts of 1760 and the letter of confirmation from January 1765. This time, the chapter fathers distinguished between ordinances and admonitions, meaning that Master de Boxadors' earlier intervention in this regard can be considered successful. However, the master of the order again found several formulations problematic. For instance, the Ordinatio Prima states that no brother may absent himself from choir prayer without his superior's permission, unless he is exempt from prayer by law or by the approved custom of the province. Regarding the phrase nisi de jure aut approbata provinciae consuetudine legitime exemptus, the master wrote in his letter that it could not be found in the constitutions. He then referred to Admonitio Tertia of the General Chapter of Rome in 1756, which states that no one may be absent from choir prayer due to a bad custom, brava consuetudo. So there is a tradition or custom of the province, but from the point of view of the general master or general legislation of the order, such a custom can be brava consuetudo. Master de Boxadors also found the Ordinatio Quarta to be at odds with the general legislation of the Dominican order. The chapter fathers believed that the morning hours were ideal for study and therefore forbade the students from going for walks in the mornings during the spring, autumn, and winter months. Only during the summer, when afternoon temperatures were higher, were the student brothers permitted to take a walk in the morning. The master of the order interpreted the documents as meaning that, aside from the stated restriction, students could generally leave the convent for recreational purposes. However, he wanted to know the reasons for granting such permission, referring to the ordinations of the general chapters of 1601 and 1605. According to these, students were only permitted to leave the convent collectively once a month. Once again, the master suspected an improper custom in the province that needed to be corrected. The master's critical attitude was also evident in two personal matters. For example, he refused to appoint a friar as general preacher because he had not taught theology for long enough. When the chapter asked him to elevate a lay brother to the clerical state, citing the brother's knowledge of Latin and good manners as justification, de Boxadors expressed surprise at what the friars wanted of him and refused the request. Of particular interest to us is the fact that the master criticized the failure to appoint a provincial historian as required by the General Chapter of 1748. While the Provincial Chapter of 1757 did appoint a provincial historian, this was not the case in 1760 for unknown reasons. The master admonished the brothers of the province of Hungary, ordering them not to neglect recording the memorable events of their province. As previously mentioned, Master de Boxadors paid particular attention to studies within the order which were to be pursued in accordance with the Thomistic tradition. In the confirmation letter for the Acts of 1757, de Boxadors welcomed the chapter's strong recommendation that professors and students should cultivate the doctrine of the Doctor Angelicus. At the same time, he referenced his encyclical to the order regarding the study of St. Thomas' doctrine dated 30 April 1757. Furthermore, the master endorsed the chapter's views on the study of church history, positive theology, and biblical languages. He added further comments on this subject in the same paragraph. But that was not all. At the end of the confirmation letter, de Boxadors issued 6 directives or ordinances concerning studies. He essentially prescribed the content of theological lectures, reaffirming the classical Aristotelian Thomistic study of philosophy, while also emphasizing the importance of knowing the basics of modern philosophy, in the sense that one must know one's enemy in order to fight them. It is important to remember that Empress Maria Theresa had been reforming theological studies in her territories since the 1750s. The aim was to make studies less speculative and more positive theological, focusing on biblical and historical aspects. The influence of the Jesuits was to be reduced and Augustinian Thomistic theology was to be introduced. In this respect, the Empress' interests and those of the Philo-Jansenist court officials coincided with those of the Dominican order. When Maria Teresa asked the Master of the Order to find a suitable Dominican for the new Thomistic chair at the University of Vienna, de Boxadors saw an opportunity to spread the true doctrine in the capital of the monarchy, even outside the purely Dominican environment. The first candidate considered by Master de Boxadors was Father Enrico de la Porta from the province of St. Peter Martyr in Italy. Between September and December 1759, letters were exchanged not only between de Boxadors and Enrico de la Porta, but also between de Boxadors and Vienna, particularly with the new director of the Faculty of Theology, the Philo-Jansenist priest Ambrose Simon von Stock. And now I am giving the answer why I mentioned those Italian registers of the Master. Actually, all these letters are registered in the register books for Italian provinces. Also, although they regard the issues of Austria, and later the communication continue to be registered in the Italian registers. Simon von Stock had been commissioned by the Empress Maria Theresa to find a professor for both the Thomistic and the Augustinian chairs at the Faculty of Theology. As de la Porta was ultimately unavailable due to illness, the Master of the Order selected Pietro Maria Gazzaniga, a friar from the province of Lombardy, who had been teaching in the General Studies in the House of General Studies in Bologna. Gazzaniga accepted the position, and by April 1760 he was in Vienna. He was given a room at the local Dominican convent. He was welcomed as a professor at the university in May and began his lectures in autumn 1760. Gazzaniga taught at the University of Vienna until 1780, after which he returned to his province. He later became prior provincial of the province of Lombardy. Several volumes of the Master of Boxadors registers for the Italian provinces reveal an intense exchange of letters between Gazzaniga and the Master of the Order between February 1760 and March 1777. While Gazzaniga's letters have not survived, we can learn a great deal about the nature of their correspondence from the Master of Boxadors' replies, which were copied into the register books. The letters dealt with Gazzaniga's work at the university, his publications, and many other topics. Given the subject of my paper, it is important to note that the Master de Boxadors also exchanged views with Gazzaniga on matters concerning the province of Hungary. Gazzaniga was his informant and, in a sense, his advisor with regard to the friar studies, among other things. The Master of the Order clearly grew to trust Gazzaniga over the years. In 1774, when de Boxadors was looking for a German-speaking friar from the Habsburg lands to fill a vacant theological position in the Casanatense library, he consulted Gazzaniga regarding potential candidates. However, as previously mentioned, the Master's registers for Italian provinces also contain responses to other ecclesiastical and secular persons from Vienna. For instance, we learn from Register Volume 4, 237, that Father Paulus Scholz, a former regent of the Studium Generale in Vienna and prior of the convent, received permission from the Master of the Order in March 1767 to become a professor of moral theology at the public university. To emphasize the letter to Scholz in Vienna, addressed to Vienna, was copied into the register for Italian provinces. This seems to me to be an important observation regarding the work of the Master of the Order's office, which may make researchers a little nervous. What factors do we need to consider to locate as many relevant sources as possible in the general archives of the Order? Where have we to search for sources? In which series? In which volumes of the registers. We can also learn about the master governance in relation to Dominican studies from the register of the Studium Generale in Vienna. So this is the only one source, or the mainly source that in the Austrian archives that says us something about the relation of the Boxadors to the situation of Dominican studies in Vienna and Austria. Although the Vicar General, Father Villavecchia, handled many affairs of the province during the master's stay in Spain, the master himself intervened on several occasions. For example, in April 1761, while in Madrid, he approved a new ratio studiorum for the Vienna Studium Generale. In June 1763, while staying in Valencia, de Boxadors sent a letter to Vienna approving new study guidelines for the houses of study of the Austro-Hungarian Dominican province. Among other things, philosophical training was to include modern philosophy and mathematics from that point onwards, provided there was absolute fidelity to the teaching of St. Thomas. In 1767, at the request of the Vienna convent, the Master de Boxadors was willing to grant a dispensation from the obligation to teach moral theology to Father Raimund Albrecht, who had been the first to teach philosophy using this new method, so tradition and modern philosophy. But it's important, this dispensation granted to Raimund Albrecht, because teaching moral theology was a prerequisite for climbing the academic hierarchy within the order. However, the master of the order evidently considered Father Albrecht's efforts sufficient grounds for an exception. But we remember, in another case, the master was not willing to grant dispensation because he said a friar didn't teach long enough theology. In this case, he granted dispensation. So also he had his own reasoning when to grant dispensation and when not to do it. From the master's letters to Pietro Maria Gazzaniga, we learned that the Boxadors was generally satisfied with the direction of theological studies in Vienna at both the university and at the Dominican Studium. This Dominican Studium was both Thomistic and anti-Jesuit, yet also moderately enlightened. Let's summarize. Although the sources from the time of Master General Juan Tomás de Boxadors, which document his governance activities in relation to the province of Hungary, are only preserved to a modest extent, they nevertheless allow certain conclusions to be drawn. The master considered the constitutions and the decisions of the general chapters to be the standard by which the life of the province, including the decisions of the provincial chapters, should be guided. It was the master's responsibility to correct any shortcomings. Promoting the studies of the friars in the spirit of the Dominican tradition was a matter close to his heart. The Boxadors had his ideas and gave clear guidelines, but at the same time he was sensitive to suggestions presented to him from the province. In general, we can say that Master de Boxadors had a clear vision of the life and mission of the friars in this province, and he used the opportunities available to him in his official capacity to make this vision a reality. Thank you.
Grazie, profesore. Vamos a pasar entonces al turno pediría al padre Alex que se hiciera cargo de la moderación. Gracias.